Can you hear me? Well before the final solution, Jews were in ghettos, being malnutritioned, dying, starving to death. If oppositions are here going to claim that they were not justified if they would have risen up against their oppressors, we do not know what is justified in this debate. What I'm going to do in this speech, I'm going to talk to you about what is vital resources and what it means to deny that access. I'm going to talk to you about justification, why we allow them this self-defense, and no matter what how successful it is. But lastly, I'm going to tell you why this is the only way to also be successful, regardless if it's important in this debate. I'll win on that as well. So let's talk about what it means, vital routes that are being taken. Look, it's an assault that no bullet or shell can do, that no bomb can do. The minute you deny grain and food to countries that have a deficit in their ability to create food, it means that there is famine within that country. It means that there is starvation and death and diseases that spread according to that. When you increase the prices of water and commodities, it's literal access to water that is denied in this motion. When you take away their ability, to access basic resources, when you take away electricity and the ability to take care of hospitals in that sense, when you take away oil and you take the ability to then create electricity that then feeds everyone and makes sure that everyone is healthy, when you deny water through rivers, all of these are things that are worse than any bullet. Any act of war that we today recognize as something that we are justified in fighting back, this is literally one of the worst, slowest deaths they can bring to a country, and we believe that we are righteous in standing up to here. Before that, yes, what is the clarification? Okay. There are several things here. Hey, can be justified doesn't mean that we can do this in situations where, just a bit of tariffs. That's not the case of the motion. It's going to be proportional. Secondly, just as well as we usually justify one side attacking, and we say that there is one side that isn't the aggressor and the other side is not the aggressor, that is usually what's going to happen under this motion. It's unclear why that changes. So let's talk about justified. First of all, can be justified is a very important nuance in this debate. Note, first of all, we will still need the attack to be proportional. It doesn't mean that there are tariffs and we nuke back. It will need to be proportional to what has happened, and we'll still apply that. That means can be justified. It's the same logic we apply on all self-defense cases. Again, and it needs to be on something that is vital. The motion clearly says vital resources. This will not be the trade war between the US and China. This will be more like the blockade that was Israel or the blockade on Gaza. It will be something more specific here. Secondly, we believe that we will be unjustified in terms of the international courts and the international community. It will be heinous. It will not be just wrong to deny these people the idea of self-defense here. We believe that it's on two levels. First of all, we do not allow the idea that we deny the dignity of standing for your humanity. When your people are starving, when your people are suffering, your only sense of humanity is by ability to try and take that back. But we also be denying them the access or the ability to actually make moves that will actually change their condition for the better. That is, in a way, if the international courts actively deny this action or say that it is wrong, they have actively helped the oppressors. They have actively helped something equivalent to the Nazis. We do not want to see our international courts here in this condition. But note, what it also means that there are actual conditions where that change that they're doing in the real world, not just on dignity, but on the fact that it might lead to a situation where some leaders in some countries will actually try to benefit themselves, and the fact that they have water at that point will try to just benefit themselves and say, I do not want to be put to court in the international arena, and might actually not try to help their people in the condition that they're in. The international courts are actually giving a reverse incentive for the leader of the country from helping his own people. This is immense harm that is happening on this motion. We believe that the leaders of the country need to work together. Lastly, on the idea of success. Note, and the same way that in self-defense, I do not care about whether it will be successful. I do not care about whether when you're fighting 5 people versus 1, you have high chances of attack. You have first of all, the right to dignity. Secondly, I just don't have the right to deny you the ability to defend yourself at that moment. I have no right to tell you that that you should do something, that it is the most basic thing of a country to defend its basic autonomy and its people. There is no right for the international courts to do that, and so we do not believe that success is relevant here. We just say that even if, and thirdly, we can never judge success. There is never a situation where you can say, oh, this was very unlikely to be successful. But even if it was a slither of a chance and more of a chance than anything, we don't see how an international court can ever actually say, this would have never been, at any chance, at any position, unsuccessful. They actually have to prove that it will, without any shred of a doubt, ever be successful. With your eyes. If a small country Right. So first off, it's not always the case, and we're here getting into my pace. First off, for example, when Egypt closed off Israel's trade routes, which would have led to a famine in Israel, Israel had enough military powers to respond. There are enough cases where the military balance is fine enough, but it needs an immediate action that economic actions are not possible. Secondly, and to respond directly, sometimes don't have equal access into denying things. So for example, Egypt could potentially stop the water from Tibet going into India. India can't respond to that because they don't have the access to the same water. So thirdly, there are sometimes sanctions or things that are due to just simply naval power versus land power. So maybe one country has land power, the other country has naval power. The naval power can blockade ports, the other one can't, and so there is an imbalance there, and therefore they need to attack through land or something like that, but it's not due to economical sanction or economical trade wars. Note, a blockade is under this motion, it's about military action here. But we believe that even in the situations where there are possibilities to make the change, let's talk about the hard ones. Let's talk about the ones when we feel it's slightly unlikely to do so. We believe that by incurring a cost on your other side, on your oppressor, by making sure that if you don't have the economical sanction, they have a price to pay. For example, whether it's the example of in, say, Gaza, where they fire rockets, and so they get better deals than Abu Mazen, who isn't doing nothing, simply and getting now $15 million each month, because now there's a cost on Israel, so therefore they're able to increase their ideas. But it also goes back all the way to even Native Americans, who when their water sources were taken constantly, only when they started fighting back, they only then managed to get some deals and reservations. Again, this is not a perfect condition. It's not saying that the world will be perfect, but we're saying that it's enough to say that there's a chance the world will improve. Very proud to propose. Do you hear me? Yeah.
Seems like a lot of the things that the OG wants to achieve can be done otherwise, right? For example, we acknowledge that international law should prosecute these countries and whatnot, right? These would be the other mechanisms to do the same things, but that lead to less harm. Without any special kind of introduction, University of Belgrade arguments. Firstly, the principle why it's unjust to do these things. Secondly, why this is a good thing and why we need to let these countries have this opportunity. And thirdly, why it leads to more military interventions. So firstly, on the principle on the principle. Notice that the international law functions on the principle of justice and justification, right? That means that your response needs to be metric to the response of the other side, right? That is to say that it functions on the self-defense principle, based around that you're only allowed to attack somebody and to respond with the same kind of the force that already attacked you previously. We say this is kind of asymmetric to what has already happened. Why is this so? Firstly, because the military intervention is directly harming lives of these people, right? While this is kind of indirect harm, right? Secondly, the harm that happens on their side of the house is much greater because you're literally destroying lives of people who are dying and everything else. We believe that harm on our side of the house exists, but it's a lot smaller. And finally, in order to defend themselves from this, they say, but this war is going to be proportional and everything else. Notice that proportional war is something that is defined by the state that is attacking, right? That there is no definition of proportional, and usually these countries do too much, go too strongly into these countries and just kill too many people or do too much harm. We say proportional war doesn't exist as long as the countries define what proportional war is themselves, right? This means that it is asymmetrical and principally unjust as an international law to recognize these things as justified, because it doesn't work on the principle of self-defense, because it's unproportional to what already happened to you. We say we are fine with prosecuting these countries as a mechanism to do these things, but this is just too much. Secondly, no, thank you. Secondly, notice that this is the current situation is usually an opportunity for a lot of countries to have the only kind of response to other countries bullying them, right? That is to say, for example, Iran, when they close, for example, the Strait of Hormuz, is the only way for them to defend themselves from being bullied by the United States and everything else. This is the only way you can ever respond as a country to another power, right? Why is this so? Notice, for example, that Iran is currently bullied a lot from the United States. There's a deal that has just been cancelled by the United States. Why? Because they can't do so, right? 3 reasons for this. Firstly, you usually don't have a strong military to respond, right? Secondly, international organizations usually have bias towards Western countries and usually towards like United States and everything else. That means that countries like China, countries like Iran can't respond on any other way, right? This is their only opportunity to respond to this country and the only opportunity to survive, basically, right? This is the only thing that you have, right? For example, Iran blocking the Strait of Hormuz or China, for example, blocking resources and everything else, right? It is good that these countries have the option. Why? Because notice the counterfactual. What happens on their side of the house? That means that these countries have no response of such. That leads to 2 things. Firstly, that leads to countries like United States bullying these countries even more, right? They know that they have a military response they can always use. They know that the other country has no response, right? Secondly, this gives you less leverage to have deals and everything else. Now, notice that currently, when the United States doesn't have this opportunity that the government proposes, right? They have to go to a negotiating table with Iran and deal with these things and everything else. On their side of the house, they have no incentive to do so anymore because they know they can always interfere militarily. We say this is incredibly, incredibly harmful, right? Notice that on their side, on our side of the house, people do live a bit worse off, but on their side of the house, the harm is incredibly proportional. Thirdly, notice that this leads to more likelihood of military interventions happening. Why is this important? Because we say that international law is usually the only restrictions countries have in order to interfere militarily, right? We do understand that sometimes they do it like unjustly and everything else, but notice that there are restrictions and there are harms if you go militarily against the international law, right? Few reasons why this is so. Firstly, like media in your country is going to go all rogue on you, right? Secondly, like other countries, other Western countries are able to point out that you did something unjustified and against the international law and everything else. Like politicians understand that they're going to be called out and everything else. This leads to the simple thing that usually, and also fourthly, notice this, and this is very important, right? This usually leads to like international scandals, right? Notice that when the United States bombed Yugoslavia in 1999, right? This emerged as an incredible scandal that led to them being more yeah, you understand what I'm going to say. So anyway, this is the only restriction you have in order not to act militarily and everything else, right? If you don't have this as a restriction, what this leads to is more destabilized regions, more conflicts, more escalation on their side of the house, right? Notice that what they wish to achieve is a good thing, but there are other mechanisms to do so. On their side of the house, a lot more harm happens, a lot more military interventions, a lot more of these things. Before we go on, I'll take closing if they have something. Go ahead, Ljubljana, make my day. It is true that they sometimes go against international law and everything else, but on your side of the house, you have even less restrictions towards those kinds of things, right? On our side of the house, at least you have some boundaries to do this, right? It's an international scandal. You have other Western countries calling you on everything else, all of the things you wish to avoid, right? On your side of the house, you have no restrictions and no boundaries, meaning that you're more likely to interfere militarily within these countries. We say this is extremely terrible and leads to more casualties, more conflicts, and more escalation in these kinds of areas, right? That's the comparative, right? So, importantly, three things. Firstly, principally, this is very important. It's an asymmetrical warfare that can be done otherwise. The force you're going to implement is just too strong, and usually proportional warfare is something that doesn't necessarily exist, right? It's defined by the country that is going to war and everything else, meaning that they usually go too strongly. Secondly, and this is very important, these countries have this is the only leverage these countries have on actually being able to survive and everything else against bullying countries. Yes, it is you, United States. There we go. I said it. And finally, this leads to more likelihood of military interventions, more escalation, more terrible things. We trust that the international law exists. We think it's very important that it still exists and gives boundaries to when you can attack someone, to when you can be military, rogue, and terrible. There we go. Go east.
So I think we established a pretty clear frame to this debate. It makes a lot of the things that we get irrelevant. We say we never know an instance that when the US really was blocked of vital resources and the things they talk about. Attacking one tanker is not in this debate. We say that, and we already stated from the very beginning, this debate is mostly about scenarios, and when we say it can be legitimate, we say that when the United States is going to nuke, as we said before, because of the scenarios, obviously this is not justified. This debate is mostly about a situation when a country is significantly blocked, when their sovereignty is harmed, and for them to actually act against us, we think this act is legitimate. I'm going to show you how we win on both levels. A, on the level of the principle, and while opening opposition are gonna agree that in a lot of very similar scenarios, the countries should attack, and this is in a lot of ways symmetric to that. And then secondly, why it is effective. I'm going to deal with all the kind of alternatives the opposition may throw at us and show you why the military intervention is crucial in a lot of ways. We call that a bit of rebuttal. A. So as I said before, the kind of scenario that they give you, well, the only option for you as Iran to defend yourself is through blocking vital resources, seems extremely weird for us. Because of the fact that you can have some sort of negotiation, because of the fact that the relationship between Iran and the United States that actually reached into agreement with a lot of countries weren't because of Iran blocking resources, but because of other reasons. So it's very unclear for us, so that the only way for you really is to block and make people actually die. And I think that they themselves want to offer other reasons, other ways for you to interact with different countries that aren't military intervention, and think in a lot of scenarios those are enough for you to create a positive interaction. You said it more than that. On the level of, well, people are gonna die because of that. You now act in military intervention. We think they lie to us on two levels. A, people die if you don't engage in military intervention, which is exactly what we say to you, which is unclear for us why attacking, even doing one attack for us, is enough for us to win this debate. We never need to engage in full-on a huge war. Even one attack is enough for us. We say more than that. We can argue for strategic attacks. We can argue that if you now attack a strategic resources for one country, now the response that should be fine is attacking another strategic resources. Yes, no, people need to actually die because of the way that we act, so it's very unclear for us. And briefly on the fact that, well, we're gonna get more military intervention, which is very unclear for us, because it means the following. Now, the reason the countries do not engage in military intervention is because the ICC said it is not legitimate, which is very strange on the level of, you have so many reasons. Definitely do not engage in military intervention. It's so harmful for your economy. It is so harmful for you to draft your entire army and to do this kind of action. We need there are a lot of reasons for you not to engage in military intervention in the status quo. It has nothing to do with what the ICC thinks is legitimate. And more than that, if you do engage in more military interventions that are illegitimate, as we said before, if the forces are not proportional, if what you do is too much in a situation that is not legitimate, you will get the kind of scrutiny from the international community, because what we argue is not that it's legitimate in all times. So let's deal here with what we give you on the principle level, because we say the following. The kind of action that we talk about in this debate are equal in a level of senses for things that opposition are going to agree with. They're probably going to agree that when someone attacks your borders, when someone attacks you, directly attacks your sovereignty, you should act. We say that in a lot of ways this is the same, but actually even more severe. Why is that? Because if a country attacks your border and you want to defend your citizens, we think that it's okay for you to engage in military action. In this situation, you're actually more likely to harm the civilians of the countries even more because, as we said before, you block their vital products and things like that. We say the basic deal with sovereignty, why we actually allow people to defend their country, is the fact that they want to protect the civilians, the fact that the basic ability of providing the civilians with the need they have in order to live. Exactly when you attack the trade routes, exactly when you do things like that, it is exactly equal to attacking them directly. So what they say is, well, the attack should be symmetric. If they attack your strategic resources and they did so economic attack, you shouldn't attack military. I think this is a very basic level of what symmetric means. We say if they attacked the way you attacked your strategic method, it doesn't matter. If someone attacked you in a tank, it doesn't mean that you should engage specifically in a tank. This is not how symmetry and proportionality works. If they attacked your strategic resources by blocking trade routes, you can actually attack them by one plane attacking the strategic resources, and this is the kind of symmetry that we are for, and this is the kind of action. We say that specifically when we say it is okay for you to attack, where, as I said before, when your civilians are being directly harmed, when an action is deliberate, as the motion states, we say it is fine for you to attack and to defend your civilians. And he said it's more than that. This is the only way for you to respond immediately, which is also crucial when you talk about self-defense. If any other method is for you is to wait for a while, to wait for sanctions, to wait for things to happen, this self-defense is not something that actually protects your sovereignty, which is crucial for you, as we said before. So let's understand why any other alternative cannot work. We say, already what we did so far is enough for us to this debate. We explained to you why in some scenarios this is the legitimate way for you to act to protect civilians, but let's win on other levels as well. We win on the level of the alternatives as well, because anything they can tell us, well, you should probably act in kind of economic ways. You should probably engage in sanctions or something like that. We say actually engaging in military intervention is a lot easier for you as a weaker force when we say you can kind of engage it. Why is that? Because economic sanction demands a lot from you and for your economy and from kind of international relationship. In order for you to engage in somewhat military action, you don't even need to have a full army. You can actually have one plane, you can have a small air force, and it is enough for you to engage. In order for you to do any other action, economic sanction, any other negotiation, you need time, you need the ability, you need the kind of international relationship that countries simply do not have. Before I continue.
Once you're allowed the this is already happened.
The opening opposition are against war in general, which seems quite weird for us because everything he said so far, once you're against proportionality, it might change. It's simply against war. We in opening government are against war crimes. We are against wars that are unproportional, and this is what we stand for in this debate. So as I said the following, for you, even as a small force, even in colonized countries that want to rebel against the colonizing force taking away your resources, your ability to engage in a fight that can be significant, you don't need a lot of forces for that, meaning that it's an immediate way for you to gain your resources back, and it's also something that you can do even if you don't have a lot of money. Why is that effective? On the sense that for a country taking away resources, they aren't allowed for it if there isn't something engaging directly against them. Once, if you take certain resources, you might need to engage in a military fight. You might need to engage in war. You might actually need to draft some army for you to defend against. Even if a small force, you still need to engage in war. Any kind of action blocking trade routes, any kind of economic field is not as beneficial for you when you now might engage in kind of a military fight. So it means even for the stronger foes, then now what they gain from such a situation is way lower than what they gain currently if you don't act in military intervention again. Because we show you that in specific situation, it is justified and should be stated as so, we are extremely proud to propose.
So firstly, on the principle, a second on why this is basically the only tool that some countries have to act against the biggest power. But before that, I just want to clarify three things. They say attacking tankers is not in this debate. Yes, it is. Because if you enable tankers to go to the Strait of Hormuz, harms happen to oil prices because they rise. I say this is a significant economical harm to some countries in which your economy is basically dependent on these resources. Note, even if the proportionate response is really, really small, I say, even if it probably means just like attacking one drone, this is something which is huge in terms of like raising the tensions and probably raising and beginning some bigger conflict. So yes, even if only one tanker is attacked and you respond by attacking one of their drones, I say this is something which has a potential to actually raise the tensions much higher. Second, they say, but you can't have negotiation. Note, it completely ignored George's analysis. Why? Because of the asymmetry of power, which very often happens in the international relationship. Negotiations are basically impossible because Iran doesn't basically have anything against the United States except the pure fact and the pure luck of their geographic position. The reason today we have negotiations in the first place is exactly because big countries are very often afraid that the smaller ones can actually block some of their resources. Currently, Apple is very much pushing Donald Trump to actually negotiate with China because they're very afraid that China is going to limit the rare earth minerals to them. I say the reason why in the status quo there are negotiations is exactly because of the threat that these countries possess. And finally, thing that I want to clarify is they say, but look, it's easier for you as a smaller country to engage in a military intervention. This is basically insane. The discrepancy between military powers of the US and basically any other state is so fucking huge that no country basically, especially like a smaller one, would never ever think to respond anything. Like Yugoslavia basically didn't respond anything exactly because we knew what the sort of backlash is going to be. And very often economical sanctions are not a tool for smaller countries. We agree, but a huge array of other countries can actually benefit this and can actually deploy this. And final response to this, it doesn't matter. Even if this isn't a successful tool, I say it is the proportionate one. Even if economical sanctions are not the tool that you can use very successfully, this is the just thing because it is the proportional thing. But let's go on the principle. And they basically say two things. This is your salt like no other. Note, a lot of the things that they portray are actually human right abuses. I say they can be tried in the international tribunal regardless of this. Blockade of Gaza, I say probably is a human rights abuse and probably some international court probably could prosecute Israel because of this. I say on a net, this is something which can be done even without this policy. Second, this is not how the world actually looks today. Why? Because the backlash of the international community that you're gonna have if you push country to go that far to limit their water supply or their electricity supply, I say this is not something which happens in 2018. It happens very rarely because of the backlash of the international community that you're gonna have. And even without this policy, it can very often be a risk for you to actually put these sanctions on a country because of the military response that they're probably gonna have. And finally, most of these abuses actually happen during the war, in which both sides are already engaged in a huge conflict. So I say this is not something which actually makes that big of a difference. Second thing, they say this will be proportionate. Economical sanctions are the thing which is proportionate, and we're completely fine with that. And they completely ignore the thing that Georgia provided you. It is not the same. Indirect harm from a citizen, which occur from raising the prices of water, it's not the same as a direct threat to the lives of these citizens. By going in their country, putting the gun to their head and saying, we're gonna obliterate you if you do not abide by our demands. I say this is not the same thing. And finally on this, who is the person who decides what the proportionate is? Already in the status quo, this is something which is very, very hard to measure. What's going to happen in their case? Politicians very often have an incentive to overstate why military response is likely and what military response is actually proportionate, especially if the tensions are high. I say probably Donald Trump can make a very a very decent case to the American citizen that proportional response against the Iran is much bigger than it actually needs to be. And finally, note, international law is very very often biased on the big and powerful country, and international courts as well. Why? Because they're very often the ones that are providing the funding, and very often the pure basis of the international law is something which is based like on the Western idea of what human rights abuses is and how the international law should look like. So even if you go into like the international court and you say, look, the military response that a country provided on us wasn't very proportionate, I say there is going to always be a bias on the behalf of these big countries. It's never going to be the same. Okay, why this is sometimes the only tool that small countries have. Closing if you have any. Okay, opening. It completely ignores everything I said. But I'm going to go back into why this is basically the only tool that some countries have. As Georgi pointed out, international relationships are very often realpolitik. There is no international law, there is only power. If a bigger country, such as the US, bullies you, you cannot proportionately answer. Why? For 3 reasons that Georgi provided you. A, because very often there is no one that you can ask for arbitration. When Yugoslavia was bombarded, even if this violated international law, there was no one that we can turn to and say, look, this wasn't very just. Iran doesn't have basically any institution to go to. China just like doesn't have the space to go to the WTO and say these sanctions are not fine. B, very often they don't have the strong military. And C, very often the big countries have huge allies. So if they want to ask for justice, and if justice is metric on their side, justice is the thing that we provided you, because smaller countries now actually have some sort of response and can actually be a threat. What are the impacts of this? A, as Georgi pointed out, these are the checks and balances on the huge power. This is why Donald Trump cannot basically do whatever he wants, exactly because this response is possible. And B, like, this is actually gonna cause aggressions in the smaller state. Like, note, like Revolutionary Guard in Iran, if they know that they cannot answer economically, what's more likely actually to happen is like more proxy wars and more drone attacks, exactly because they cannot use economical sanctions as a weapon. They have to turn to other avenues, because very often the tensions are really high in these countries, and there is an incentive to actually be very violent. We beg you to oppose.
I think what we hear from OG is a very nice principle case, which we totally agree with, but they never really show you any impacts or how the behavior of states is actually going to change if the motion is passed. So we believe that in this regard, OO does a better job, because they do try to give you some mechanisms in which they try to prove you how the behavior of states will change. So what are these mechanisms that OO gives you? We say, firstly, they talk about how countries are more likely to militarily intervene, because now they won't go to the negotiation table, they won't discuss with other countries how to solve the issue. But here, the thing is that countries usually don't like to go to war, right? Because it is costly in terms of economics, it's costly in terms of cost of lives and stuff like that. OO never proves to you why countries will just make a leapfrog, go away from the negotiations directly to the war if this doesn't make sense to them. But the second claim they make on how this will change the behavior of states is how the international law is somehow this thing that is mysteriously stopping countries from retaliating in a military way when they're economically sanctioned or whatever. We have 3 reasons that prove to you like why this assumption does not stand. First is that producing a casus belli and a reason for war is incredibly flexible, right? We can see how the United States have practically invented nuclear weapons in Iraq in order for them to justify the war there. We can see how other countries have, invented violations against their minorities in other countries, so they had a reason to intervene. And especially it is easy to manufacture casus belli in these times when responsibility to protect has become some kind of already a common law, right? So we say that if we make this marginal difference by making retaliation when it comes to economics a reason for war. We don't believe it actually changes anything. Maybe it takes a week less for the Secret Service to produce evidence for war otherwise. Secondly, even if this is true, right? Even if it is true that countries will then be less able to produce a reason for war and go into war, we say that other countries generally don't care if one country is breaking the law, right? Especially look at how this debate was framed so far. It's about big countries pressuring the small ones. So we say that even if a country is then goes into the violation of law, it is highly unlikely that they will do anything against it, right? And this leads me to the third thing of negation is that even if there is a big, pressure on one country that has broken the war, that has broken the rules and has retaliated, there is basically no mechanism to force the country, that country to do anything else, right? They mention Israel on OO and how all the violations on Gaza and they can be solved in other ways, but the thing is they aren't, right? There is no way to force a country that is violating the international law to do something different. Like Israel has been in perpetual violation of it for the last 70 years. Nothing has been done against it. Now, to directly deal with the naive assumption on OO when they say that other mechanisms are there to provide, to resolve this conflict, we have already told you that there is no incentive. But even if we naively trust ICJ or which other mechanism, we say that it's much more likely to be solved in a legal way when this conflict is perceived. The economic conflict is perceived as a conflict where the matter of existence is in question, right? Because we say that in their world, such conflicts are much more likely to be solved by, arbitration court of the WTO, whereas in our case, it becomes the urgency, a question of greatest urgency, most likely to be upheld by ICJ. We have proven you that, that we believe that this is unlikely, but still, in their world, we win. Now, moving on to, strictly to my extension, and what we have proven thus far is that basically if a country wants to go to war, it will probably go to war because they can produce reasons for that. Now, how will the behavior of the states that retaliate against economic sanctions change when we pass the motion? And listen carefully because it's just slightly counterintuitive. We say on CG that you don't alienate the country from the international community, right? The one that has decided to go to war. Now, why is this important? Because in today's world, when a country retaliates against economic sanctions, it is immediately prone to condemnations and sanctions from the UN. Why? Because there are legal grounds for doing so, right? You can't retaliate with weapons when someone economically sanctions you. So we say that when we in the current world, it is highly likely that either the General Assembly will accept certain resolutions against the country or the Security Council. What this means is that the country waging war is way less likely to cooperate with the UN and its institutions, right? We say that for two reasons. Out of principle, it cannot cooperate with someone that is condemning the actions of the country, and secondly, because of internal domestic issues, right? It can present itself as someone who is fighting with the public of the international community as the victim and stuff like that. Before I continue, opening.
As when Trump decided he doesn't like their sanctions.
We don't know and we don't care because it doesn't matter what the international law says. China will do whatever it will do. It doesn't matter what is written there. But it is important if China decides to wage war, how it will wage it, and this is what I'm talking about. So to put more substantive into what I'm talking, what does it mean when a state that is waging war doesn't communicate with you and doesn't want to talk to them? We say that it is way likely, for example, to accept mediation from the UN organizations, right? And the mediation that the UN can provide is hugely important, because of the influence that the UN has, the respect, and we believe also on a micro level, the skills that those mediators have, right? When one country isn't ostracized from the beginning, it's very likely that then the conflict will be solved. Secondly, we say it's more likely to accept the help of UN sister or whatever organizations into the country when the war is happening, such as the Red Cross, and the one that make the war better. And thirdly, and very importantly, it is more likely for the state to continue respecting international law, especially the law of armed conflict, right? Because it's not it's not in the violation of international law from the very beginning, so it's not attacked from the other states, and it's doing everything that's legally right? So the harm of doing some harm, some war brutality is that much greater because it then starts violating international law and then can get all the negative impact. Because of all those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
I think the biggest strategic mistake that comes out from opening government is that they're willing to say that all you need is one plane and then you retaliate. I think the problem that happens with this movement is that as soon as one country has responded to you militarily, just with one plane, I absolutely guarantee you, you're going to want to have a population that is screaming for revenge of this. The missing framing in this debate is essentially that the places and where that it is that we take away these vital resources is first of all in places that are already in times of conflict, or second of all in places where it is that diverge with our self-defense. The most important piece of analysis that CIO is specifically going to bring to the debate is why essentially it means that we end up having significantly more militarily intervention, because I guarantee you, you're not going to be willing to dare waging war with a single plane against a country that has already been able to take away your vital resources. You're going to know that they're going to respond. You're going to want to have a military ready for that defense when it occurs. I think this is an important piece of framing. Insofar that OG presents as the metric that it is people that are dying, that is something that we should care about, we're happy to say that that is the side that should win today's debate. That's why I think that the reason that aggressors are going to be more likely to wage war is the most important aspect here, because essentially it means that we end up having more powerful countries having a greater interest in military intervention. Something that at the end of the day is just essentially crucially more harmful to you than any sort of economic sanctions are going to be. Mostly for the fact you're basically dead when a bomb drops upon you. Not necessarily true when it's just a block of... I'm going to give you 5 pieces of substantial reasons why it is that we're going to end up with more war here. The first reason we're going to get is that countries are going to respond. When it is that Jordan is allowed to respond militarily following international law to when Israel blocks the Jordan River from them, I think this is when Israel is going to see, you know what, Jordan did this to us, and now I'm going to be willing to militarily respond because they don't end up looking weak towards my country. That means that the aggressors in and of themselves are going to believe that they have a right to respond. Second of all, and the problem with the answer to my POI in the beginning is that they're going to say that the international law doesn't protect you when you defend yourself from the attack that has happened. I think the problem here is that now you're going to begin to disregard international law, because international law essentially allowed for you to not be able to respond to an attack you believe happened. I think the second piece of important framing here is a lot of times it happens in times of self-interest. I think specifically when we talk about, lack of water that is desperately needed from harvest, I think governments are likely to cut off these vital resources from certain countries in order to have them for their own population. That essentially means that on both sides of the house, there are people dying from absolute drought and lack of water. They believe it's okay for one country to militarily respond, essentially creating more victims overall when this happens. Second piece of framing. I think the second place in which we cut off vital resources is essentially when we use very aggressive sanctions in order to combat what has been, extremist governments and places we need to hold. I think it's an important piece of framing, and an OG reality check is that we don't essentially just like to cut off vital resources for countries. We think essentially most governments don't really just want to screw over other people in that sense. I think the important thing here is that we then end up doing it when we see governments who are in times of genocide. I think when, for instance, in times of genocide, that's when we absolutely want to cut off this country in order to make sure that they don't, that they cannot continue, for instance, buying, more military or whatever, in order to protect themselves further. I think when we give them this option to then militarily respond, we take away the international community's most effective weapon against other people. I think this essentially is what we should. This essentially is going to end up that we're going to lead to more war, because essentially the consequence is going to be the same. Third piece of conflict. Because essentially, when you are in this piece of conflict, either because you're trying to make a government that has committed atrocities better, or when you're in times of already conflict, you're not going to take the first step of using, military sanctions in order to get them to better, because you know that that's going to mean that they have legally allowed to respond to you any sort of place. I think this is when you begin yourself to build up the offense in order to prepare for the attack that's going to happen to you. I think we're going to see a military escalation, and I think second of all, you're going to believe that the consequence is in the end the same. That is when you're going to be likely to go in the first place without having the crucial discussions that I think sanctions need to. Because at the end of the day, what brings North Korea to the table to talk to Donald Trump about bettering conditions for its population is not the fear of the military. It is the idea that sanctions can be lifted upon the entire population as a whole. You're taking away that from us when we have to fear a military attack that they would be legally allowed to. Something absolutely apprehensible. Fourth reason is that you make people make the wrong choice. Recognize here that the framing we get from the entire government side is that, oh, you know what, now you just need one plane when this happens, and you'll just respond to the country took away your vital resources. I think what's quite important in this debate is that is when countries, as I think very nicely CG frames to us, is going to be less likely to cooperate with the United Nations. I think this is when you're going to be less likely to receive the aid that you need in times when someone has taken away your vital resources, because you are going to be seen as aggressor. At the end of the day, regardless of it being legal or not, when we think about the US invasion of Iraq, we all think that they're kind of assholes, and we probably wouldn't want to just send in massive loads of resources to the country and help them. That means you make countries take the wrong choice under the idea that it is legally good. The fifth and most important reason, no thank you, is that you essentially end up giving people, aggressors specifically, an excuse to have something. I think this looks like when the United States in 2011 hacked and infiltrated Iran's water supply, taking away a vital resource. I think first of all they could do so because now it would be highly likely that Iran would militarily respond, something that would be more likely to following their understanding. Yes, quickly.
I have to tell you,
I understand it. First of all, I don't think you proved it. Second of all, I think there's more famine overall when the countries militarily responded to it. I think this is when the United States is going to be likely to say, you know what, it is fine for me to take away this vital resource, because either I just screw over Iran's water supply, that is good in and of itself, because this country is my enemy, or Iran militarily respond to me, in which case I have the perfect excuse for my population to gain the most important political capital to enter into a nation that we would else see certain people be somewhat apprehensible in order for us to just militarily intervene. Recognize that probably the most important to a country and a nation as a whole is when they feel that they are being attacked, specifically in the context of the home nation thinking that this is right. I think second, this is why essentially that the most important crucial piece of analysis here that leads to more war. I think you should care about this because international law was created under the assumption that we would have less war overall. Even in times where we see horrible governments, we respect their sovereignty to diminish conflict. We even see that peacekeeping troops needs to be invited in. I think it is wrong for international law to postpone an agenda that essentially leads to more escalating conflicts overall. I've never been more proud to stand on the side of our position.
Closing opposition's case is dead at the moment we did not respond to Rogue's extension. Closing government is the only team that does not operate under the naive assumption that just that you write a different rule in the UN Charter means that the whole world is going to suddenly change the perspective of. I'm going to engage closing opposition by whipping up material brought up by Rogue and to finish off, explain to you why the opening part of the debate, especially OG, are out of. First of all, Rok explains to you that war is not something countries like to do. The cost of war is tremendous. The cost of lives, the cost of for your economy, all the lost the productivity when your industry has to shift around, all of those things mean that countries don't like to go to war, especially against stronger enemy. The reason why North Korea does not go to war with the USA right now is because they realize that A, they cannot afford one, and B, they will be fucking obliterated. Furthermore, we tell you, this debate does not give a much larger additional incentive for people. Already have a wide array of potential causal belli you can invent, find, and just the fact that now you have another possibility to find does not mean that there is a substantial improvement of the country's possibility to go to war. Second of all, Rok explained to you that international law in the end of the day is not something countries respect. First of all, because it is, to a very large extent, a dead letter on a piece of paper, but furthermore, because there is no mechanism in most cases to uphold international law. It is funny to us, closing opposition talks about how there is now going to be so much more war, because in the end, the premise of the framing Rok gives to you is that if there is a country who is right now in status quo willing to go to war, that country is going to be willing to go to war like in the other world as well. And if there is now a country that doesn't want to go to war, it won't go to war. The fact that they have an additional causa belli, additional excuse that they can use to justify it legally, is not going to mean that a country that would not go to war in status quo is now going to go to war. The majority of what closing opposition talks about is essentially irrelevant. Rok brings to you two important pieces of analysis. The first one was in response, the second one our extension. One in response was concerning the International Court of Justice. In the international relations for the last 100 years, the trend was to try and solve as many conflicts peacefully. This is why we have courts such as the ICJ, arbitration courts, tribunal. The problem of ICJ in the current status is twofold when it comes to conflicts that we are describing today. First of all, because there is no such big condemnation of economic extortion yet, there is no such great incentive to legally persecute. When economic extortion becomes something that is causa belli, that is clear enough in the international law to cause war, the legal arguments used by ICJ mean that you can have stronger and faster prosecution. However, furthermore, secondly, you can have more prosecution and more effective court systems, because now the urgency to solve those issues is much greater, because as opposition have you believe, you have a higher risk of war. Second thing that Rok brings to you, and again, closing opposition never tackles this. Rok brings to you how it is important that in the events that war happen, and once again, the delta here does not exist. War happens either way, like the number of wars happening is not going to change. But when a war happens, it's important that the actual war is within the legal boundary. Why is that? When a country breaks international law, we told you earlier that they don't really care about international law. However, there still is a distinction between breaking international law and not breaking international law when you go to war. Because when you currently in status quo, when you do go to war, by the fact that you break international law, you realize that you're going to be condemned by the United Nations, and you realize that internally, domestically, because of that, you're not going to have the argument of following international law with your people anymore. At the point where you're able to justify going to war, you're also able to justify that. This has three important effects Rok brings to you that are never responded by closing opposition. First of all, the war is less likely to have UN mediation. United Nations mediation way how a third party can intervene into a conflict and make sure that it is solved in the fastest manner efficiently. When a country already knows that it broke the international law, it knows that the UN mediation is not a favorable option for them anymore. This is why they are less likely to proceed. Second of all, they are less likely to let UN Red Cross and other observers, such as the refugee help support and like the Médecins Sans Frontières and things like that, into their country, which worsens the conflict. And third of all, they are less likely to follow the rules of armed conflict. Because if a war is legal, the country now has at least a slightly bigger incentive to follow other rules of war as well, as opposed to when it already knows it's broken all the laws. Actually, I'm going to take opening now.
Law is not as you say. Why would countries actually ICJ when actually?
Oh, this is a very important. No, wait. It is a fair question, but it is a very important distinction, and it's a very nuanced distinction. The thing is, when you have a question of war, war is such a big and important and monumentally costly decision that when a country decides to go to war, the argument of, oh, but we're breaking international law is much less important, because at the point where you are committed enough to fight in an armed conflict, international law is not such an important thing. However, international law is more important when it comes to smaller issues, such as gassing civilians and things like that, which is something that Rok explains to you. For instance, Bashar al-Assad would probably wage war either way, right? But if Bashar al-Assad was not condemned from the get-go, it would perhaps be more likely for him to stick to at least some international rules. Why? Because, now it's already too late for him. But finally, about the opening tables, real quickly. We think that opening opposition and opening government agree with themselves on a lot of times, and they cannot really prove any pragmatism on either way. There is one thing, however, that needs to be said. The principle, we just don't care in this debate, because if a white privileged debater, such as anyone in this room, can go to sleep knowing that the world is more principle, I don't know how big of a delta that is towards the debate. CG is the one nuanced, realistic and unnaive team in this debate. This is why CG takes it, but also let's vote OO because OO are our friends. Thank you very much.
CG doesn't want to be our friends, then I'll start by responding to their case and explain why they're out of this debate. Their mechanism is to say, look, international law doesn't work, but here's how it works here. So first of all, we're going to explain, we think that the mechanism that exists for preventing war crimes, which is their primary mechanism, is the same on either side. The mechanism for preventing war crimes is also distinct and different from the mechanism that we're changing with this model. That is, first of all, a big question mark as to, well, how does this change under this model? Why do we need to pass this motion? We think that the fact that the ICC is the main contributor to holding people accountable for that, and the ICJ is in this motion, we think that we question that. But secondly, we want to say that the countries that are probably most likely to commit these war crimes probably don't care anyways. It's funny that they bring up Bashar al-Assad. I think that it's hard to argue that Bashar al-Assad would care about anything in any scenario other than maintaining power. We think that it's hard to recognize in which situations people would care about one thing but not about the other. I don't think that they made that distinction. But we give you analysis as to why they wouldn't specifically. We think that specifically war, and when it escalates to war, is when a conflict becomes emotional. And those are the situations, emotional for the population and for the leaders as well. Those are the situations where, first of all, escalation is more likely, retaliation is likely in some sense, but more importantly, we think that it is less likely that they're going to respect the small rational incentives that there might be in international law. We think that international law is the weakest when something escalates into a conflict, and that is the primary stance that you'll get from closing opposition in this scenario. Last thing about closing government, just to hammer it home, they talk about how countries don't like to go to war in general, and therefore they'll be careful about making those decisions. We don't think that that's the case. They also talk about the United States, and we think that there are many countries that are happy to go to war as long as they think that on balance it makes sense for them. We think that those are largely going to be the big countries and the bullies that Clara talks about, how their incentive structure changes. Now going on to our own case, what is it that we bring on closing opposition? We bring you specifically, and this is the change also from opening opposition, notably. We bring you a change in the incentive not from the responder or from the victim, but from the aggressor in the first place. We say that specifically when the response mechanism is the same for making economic sanctions as it is for making an act of aggression, that is to say that those fall under the same category of self-defense, then we think that we don't see why it's less likely that they would choose to go to war. We think specifically it means that in some scenarios that might be a more viable option. That is to say, to sink an oil tanker, to hack into a water supply, which is an actual act of aggression, rather than economic sanctions. Right. We think that comes then down to a clash of whether there will be more or less war. We think that when it comes to war, this debate is probably very low impact. We think that it does very little regardless. We think that the mechanisms that we see on government side, we think that it's unlikely that actors that go into war are going to change the way that they respect the ICC and the laws about war crimes. We think that it's unlikely the way OG talks about how people are going to recognize the threat of sanctions and retaliate and how that is going to be meaningful. We think that it's unlikely that there's going to be a large change there. Maybe a small one. Especially because we think that if a country is desperate enough to respond with a military response in a case where they are so harshly economically sanctioned that they want to do that, we think that they're probably going desperate enough to do it even if international law doesn't recognize it. But we think that also reflects onto there's a little change to the war incentive. We recognize that most countries that want to go to war will do it on either side. But the fact that there is a small change to that incentive and that there are scenarios where aggressive war and that acts of war is a viable option, we think that impacts infinitely more than the fact that some countries might choose to retaliate with conflict rather than do nothing. And the fact that they might feel better about themselves because they could send a plane against the big bully of the United States rather than not send that plane. I think that impact is what should be weighed primarily in this debate. Let's talk about then the clash if we think that is what closing opposition takes it on. But if we don't, let's talk about the rest of the debate and how it plays out. We think that there is a debate upon whether whether it's most effective to be in the status quo versus under the government's model. Firstly, once again, we explain specifically how incentive structures change for the aggressor, but we also explain how the incentive structures change in terms of retaliation. We think that the fact that you choose to send a plane rather than to shout out to the international community and say, help us, we're literally being oppressed, we think is something that is harmful. First of all, because of the cycle of retaliation that Clara talks about. When someone is being retaliated against, that is ammunition that can be used. So whether the country is wanting to do that intentionally, and Clara gives you some reasons as to why that might be the case. If they have an enemy, why not, and especially if you're a big bully nation like China or the United States, why not bully them into an armed conflict where you can hammer them down rather than simply economic sanctions that can be lasted out and that takes a longer time and where you can be condemned for your actions for a longer time. We think that specifically due to the unique risk of escalation, we think that the fact that retaliation happens is problematic. Opening. Okay, I don't understand. I think that still sounds uncomparative to me, but I guess you'll be the judge of that. In terms of principle, I'll get to that in a second. Lastly, international law is malleable, and it is on both sides. That means that government hasn't yet explained, and unfortunately doesn't have another chance to, but hasn't yet explained why it is that also applies to the significant harms of sanctions. We think that it is likely that big bully nations are just going to game the system and just do sanctions that are harmful, but not enough, whatever it might be, under sanctions. Finally, in terms of principle, we don't see why the principle of self-defense changes and why it should change in this way. We think what's more important is the principle that stands behind international law, and that is to avoid conflict. International law, and specifically the rules about conflict, were made in the context of World War I and World War II to avoid further conflict. That is also why it's called United Nations.
And we think that to that extent, we think that it's important that we maintain that principle, and we think that that is more impactful than anything else. To avoid conflict to the biggest extent possible, and just to beat CG because they don't want to be our friends, vote us.